Hi there, I'm Tom, and welcome to the brand new podcast that we're doing, where we will be talking about life, the universe, and games. With me, I have my good friend Alex.
Hello!
And basically, the idea behind this is that we're going to pick a topic that we're going to stick to splendidly, then get distracted and talk about something more interesting. And so, to start off with, I decided that we're going to revisit something which we've kind of talked about previously but didn't come to any conclusions. And it all comes from when I was playing Titanfall with my old hardware setup. I noticed that I was getting low frame rates and I was dying an awful lot more. And this was a really noticeable thing when I was recording, because I would have a far lower kill to death ratio and I would have far less luck in encounters with other pilots. So it got me thinking, does the PC multiplayer scene have an inherent bias towards people with more powerful hardware? Is it unfair to people with lower hardware? And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, it's one of these. I don't think we're going to come to any conclusions. I don't think we can come to any conclusions from this, but it's a topic of debate.
Yeah, I think one of the main problems here is I've spent a lot of money on PC hardware, especially for recording, and so I do almost all of my gaming on the PC. I used to be a console gamer, but I've really drifted away from that scene. And Alex is kind of the opposite. He will do most of his gaming on either a console or a lower powered laptop.
Yeah, I mean, I have a PC, and it's not the most powerful thing, and I do play it. I enjoy playing games on PC. It's just I very much represent the other side of the argument. I'm not going to say one's better than the other. We're not even going to touch that topic.
Yeah, that's something for people with far more reputation than us.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to say we both agree. We both like both. We don't think either's necessarily better. They both have their advantages and disadvantages, but that's, as I said, another topic entirely. This is more...
We both accept that the other form of playing games is perfectly acceptable, and we just have our own preferences that works better for us. So, the main argument here, the reason that we're bringing up the difference between consoles and PCs is because obviously everyone who has a console will have the exact same hardware. And because multi-platform multiplayer is very rare and unheard of, if you buy a console and you buy a game on that console, you will know you've got exactly the same hardware requirements and exactly the same lag or restrictions as anyone else who bought it on that hardware and is playing you in multiplayer.
With a few exceptions of being third-party software, such as third-party controllers that might have additional functions and stuff. But that's all comparatively minor stuff, really.
Yeah, there are certain controllers, like with Turbo 5 or something, but it at the end of the day, it has less of an impact on player skill and more of an impact on player laziness.
Yeah, it's more... That's more personal preference rather than any real game changer, I would say.
There are certain things which are, of course, banned in console competitions, but you can't really help. If someone's going to use something like that, then essentially they're kind of cheating if they use something which is too overpowered, and most terms and conditions of games will prohibit you from using a controller like that. And I know that if Xbox Live, for example, detects you using something which will give you an advantage like that, it will just ban your account straight off. So, in comparison to all of that, the PC scene is not restricted in any way, shape or form when it comes to hardware.
Varied, to say the least.
Yeah. Some games do cap out your frame rate. Titanfall by default caps it out to 60 frames a second, and there is hacks to get around that, but that's mainly useful for higher refresh rate monitors rather than an actual advantage. I think playing a game at 60 frames a second is the kind of default for competitive play. So that's something which the games can do, but apart from that, if you don't have hardware capable of hitting 60 frames a second when you're playing Titanfall or any other fast-paced shooter or Twitch shooter or anything like that, then we're trying to decide whether that gives you a disadvantage, a major disadvantage. And as I said before, it's apparent to me in my play that when I was playing at 30 and recording, I did have a disadvantage.
I think the basis of it is that there is definitely some kind of advantage disadvantage, but it's how significant that is, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's also a case of, is this unfair, or is this something which the PC gamers have to put up with? And I actually went to Twitter and I asked for people's opinions on this, and I got 2 replies. And both were on the opposite sides of the debate, so...
okay, that's fairly helpful. And we can obviously chuck our own stuff in there as well, so...
Yeah, so first off we had Koshi George, who basically said what's unfair is expecting the game developers to cater to lower spec machines, which is all very well and good, except the developers put out minimum specs and recommended specs, and I can guarantee you that if you're playing on minimum specs, you're not going to be getting 60 frames a second. So that kind of turns the debate into another question of, should the developers ensure that the minimum specifications do meet a minimum set of requirements? There's no guidelines at the moment that says whether a developer can claim a minimum requirements. So does there need to be guidelines put in place that will allow a PC user to look at the minimum requirements and say, okay, I meet the minimum requirements and this means I will be getting X, rather than looking at them and say, okay, the game will run, and that's all they know.
Yeah, this is a tough one, because from their point of view, they're not going to do that. They're going to put the minimum in that it will run on without problems, because if they raise those minimum specs, then they're precluding potential sales, which of course is not something they want to do.
And the other thing is, not all users are equal. And some people will be perfectly happy playing Titanfall at 30 frames a second, and certain people will be at the skill level where it doesn't make any difference if they're playing at 30 or 60. The only real reason I noticed it so much on Titanfall is because, number one, I was trying very hard to improve as fast as possible, and number two, I was recording at the same time, so I was essentially inflicting twice as much lag on myself as I needed to.
I mean, the thing to note here, of course, is that anyone using lower spec systems probably isn't going to be that seriously into major playing, per se, if that makes... I mean, obviously, as you said, you found it because you were recording, but...
Yeah, but at the same time, not everyone has unlimited money. If they can't afford a console, which would be preferred for a lower budget, but if they can't even afford a console, then they may be stuck playing on a lower spec laptop or a lower spec PC, which at that time isn't quite able to produce the recommended requirements, but it can meet the minimum requirements. So it's not always... Like, they may want to be a pro-level player, or I say pro-level player, but they may want to improve, but they may be handicapped by their current financial situation.
Well, I'm sure you found this. We've both got new laptops recently, and laptops it's very hard to get a decent laptop. I mean, there are gaming-level laptops for a lot of money. Yeah,
starting off at something around the region of £2,000, which is probably about $3,000-ish, I expect.
I don't know what the exchange rate is at the moment.
2,500 to 3,000, but
yeah.
And this is mainly, I blame Microsoft for this, I really do, because they've been pushing the Windows 8 Surface tablets and similar spec machines. And so the higher end PC market, or higher end laptop market I should say, has disappeared almost entirely. I recently bought a new laptop for work, and I decided to go a bit more powerful than I strictly needed, but I found it very difficult to meet my requirements. My only real requirements were that I wanted a 1080p screen and something more than an i3 processor, because I tend to have a lot of windows open. And I had to pay a lot of money to get that. Not quite gaming money, but still a fair chunk, so...
Well, we both bought similar laptops in a similar region, really, didn't we? Probably about a similar sort of thing. I mean, my laptop, it's probably my primary computer. I do have a computer, as I say, that I use for gaming and things mostly. But I'm much more of a laptop user. And as I say, it works fine. I mean, I can play Titanfall on it. I played Titanfall on it. But I don't go into stats like you, so I don't know what my frames per second or anything were. But I could play it quite well, and I did as well as I would expect to do for someone who plays relatively little PC gaming.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I only started recording my frame rate when I discovered that I was playing a lot better when I wasn't recording. And something I really noticed was that it was a lot bigger gap than I thought it was when I was recording, so that's really why I noticed that. And also, because I do record and I do watch back the footage when I'm editing it, or when I'm making sure the quality's okay, I do get to see the difference between things which happen when I'm recording and things which happen when I'm not recording. And it's actually really interesting to see, okay, in these two situations I put the same number of bullets into the pilot in roughly the same spread, but I died when I was recording because there was just that little bit of lag which caused one of my bullets maybe to not hit quite as soon, or not register the firing quite as soon. Although Titanfall uses hit scan, which I won't get into too much, but it basically means as soon as you put your cursor over someone and hit fire, then if there's someone in your cursor, then it counts as an instant hit. So that kind of lag is slightly less noticeable, but it's still there, obviously. So the other thing that came up on Twitter from a user called Glorious Underdog is that Twitter people have funny names sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's that yes, of course, there's a decrease in reaction times on basically. This will cause an issue on games which require fast reaction times, which I pretty much just said, and the developers should focus on optimizing their engines as much as possible in order to accommodate as lower spec machines as possible. And even if they optimize the machines then and keep the same minimum specs, then it may be that the minimum specs can get a bit better performance, so to speak. And I kind of agree with this, because a lot of industry engines probably aren't optimized as much as they can be.
Yeah, I mean, what they tend to do is they tend to put in loads of, or quite a lot of eye candy for the people who have very powerful hardware, but they don't tend to cater so much for the lower end of their spectrum.
Yeah, console developers as well. You'll notice with the PS3 particularly, when it got to the end of the PS3's life cycle, you started getting games like The Last of Us and Heavy Rain, which were visually very spectacular. And the reason that you got those at the end of the life cycle and not at the beginning was that because the graphics market was moving on so much, partly driven by the PC graphics market, I guess, the consoles had to do everything they could to compete with that, and so they were using every single trick in the book to eke out as much performance as they could from their engines as possible.
Yeah, and the question is if they obviously can do this, so why don't they? I mean, you find this with every generation of consoles. You look at some of the later PS1 games, some of the later PS2 games, some of the later games from Xbox.
Yeah, and it makes sense because the more you work with a set of hardware, the more you get to know it, the more you know how far you can push it, and so on. And I know from um, sort of hearing online and stuff, The Last of Us was the death of more than a few
Yeah,
PS3.
this of course is the downside to this thing, is they push them, and the flip side of this argument, as we say, is that yes, they could do these games and cater for lower spec machines, and so that it makes these games much more playable on these lower spec machines. But then, if they're running them on these lower spec machines, are they going to be killing them? I mean, basically, the last two laptops I've had have died because of graphical or CPU issues. They've basically been pushed to the to the end of their lifespan, killed.
But that kind of it kind of goes back to the PC's a bit more complicated. You're expected to kind of know when you're pushing your computer a bit too far, and to a certain extent, you should know if your PC or laptop is getting hot a lot of the time. And there are programs out there that let you monitor the temperature of your CPU. So ideally, you could have something where you know that it's operating within normal specs, and if they push the engine a bit farther and optimize it a bit more, but then don't change the lower end of the minimum specs, then I think it would be a bit safer, because you've got the same people playing with the same hardware, but now they're getting a bit more a few more frame rates, not because their hardware is working any harder, but because your engine is working more efficiently.
Yeah, I mean, the big problem is diversity, isn't it? The computer market changes so rapidly. I mean, you look at hardware that was brand new a couple of years ago, and you compare it to the new stuff, and it very, very quickly is changing and changing and changing, and there's several new models out by that point. And when you consider the fact they have to cater for as many as possible, you can understand to a certain degree why some of them suffer, especially the cheaper end, because people who have lower spec machines, who pay less for them, are less likely to spend as much on games. Realistically, they are a business. They have to make as much money as they can. So they're going to cater for the people who spend the most money. I mean, you see this all the time. People on iPhones, for example, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure I heard that people on iPhones are more likely to, or not necessarily iPhones, but let's say upper end smartphones then, are more likely to spend more money on apps.
Yeah, it's
because they paid more for their phones. They're more willing to spend money. So
it's definitely iPhone specifically that makes more money on the apps, mainly because
I heard a news report with an interview with a guy who was started one of these companies, and he was saying that it's been unproven to happen in the UK, but they've proven that in America and some other countries, a lot of these hotel quoting websites, like cheap comparison websites, will detect what type of device you're using. And again, with these people who are using high-end smartphones, they obviously are willing to spend a bit more money. They've actually been proved to be quoting them higher prices, charging them more for the exact same rooms.
Yeah, I read that too, and I think it's due to the mentality of Android users versus iPhone users, and I'm trying not to make a generalization here, this is just what the data shows, but an iPhone user is more likely to spend money on an app up front to pay, say, $1.29 or $2.50 or whatever to buy the app outright, and Android users are more likely to want their apps for free and be less likely to actually pay up front. So the Android app market is mainly based around free-to-play transaction type things, or microtransactions, and the same thing doesn't work so well on iOS. But I've just forgotten what the original point was. Yeah, lower spec machines.
Lower specs, yeah.
Yeah, I think the main problem is, you said variety, but I'm going to take variety in a different direction. there's so many users out there, and you will find it very hard to find the ones with the exact same hardware as each other.
Yeah.
When you list minimum or recommended specs on your game, you usually find on the really good ones they'll have one AMD card and one Nvidia card.
That I must say, as a sort of, as I say, a lower spec computer user, so to speak, that's one of the things that really annoys me, because essentially what you have to do, I know it's very hard for them to do, but they quote this for you and you're like, well, how does that compare to my one? You then have to go out of your way to then look at comparison benchmarking type things to find out whether yours can run it or not. And that confuses me.
Yeah, and
my simple brain.
If you're willing to wait until after launch, then you can go to a site like Can I Run It, and they will do the comparisons for you. You can go there before launch, I believe, but I think they will probably have more data after launch than they do before launch. So it's a very good website. It does use a Java applet, but it basically scans your computer, works out what hardware you've got, and compares that to the hardware listed on the minimum or recommended requirements, and says how well you're likely to play the game given a set of factors. So something like that's really good, and there's actually, according to people on the Steam forums, so not exactly the best source possible, but part of the Steam API, which you can access if you're if you have the right developer type stuff, and it's what websites which let you compare your Steam library or tell you how much your Steam library is worth. These all plug into the Steam API, and apparently there's a section of that API which does something similar and says whether you can run the game, and it's not part of the Steam client, and I kind of see why, because at the moment Steam is a very it's very hands off, and I think it wants to remain that way.
Yeah, I can understand that, because as it falls, if there's any problems, they can sort of wash their hands of it and say, well, don't come to us, it's not our fault. Whereas if they start to involve themselves in this to a certain extent, it becomes a grey area, and suddenly
it's basically putting the onus of responsibility on Steam, because Steam has said you can play this, and you're like, okay,
Yeah.
I'll play it, and then it goes back to what we're saying.
Suddenly they make one mistake and there's a flood of owners of that particular type of graphics card moaning at Steam saying, well, you told me I could run it, and
it's not just that, it's I think we mentioned it before during this podcast, but different people will be happy to accept different levels of quality from a game. There are some people who will not play a game unless it's 60 frames a second, and there are a lot of people who will be quite happy at 30 frames a second. Now, if Steam says your computer can run this, and they start running it and suddenly it's 30 frames a second and they want 60, then it's like, well, Steam said I could run it and I can't run it to my particular requirements. So, yeah, I think the varied PC market and varied combinations of hardware are really something which is having a big effect here, because that's exactly what is stopping a developer from having a very strict set of guidelines that says you will need X hardware to run at 30 and Y hardware to run at 60 and Z hardware to run it with all settings max. And there's even some games where that would be a disadvantage to them, because they wouldn't physically be able to list any hardware which can list it as max, which is sort of available to the consumer. They're that demanding.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. This is a kind of a tricky situation here. Like,
well, we've done a lot on this side of the argument. Let's try the other side. Consoles, obviously, as we say, are all pretty much uniform. You get slight variations in models with where you might have like a Slimline model, or even like they'll do different versions if, for example, they have problems with early hardware, like I think I forget which console was in the previous generation, but one of them had was it the PlayStation 3 had disk tray errors or something in some of the early ones?
The fast generation PS3, the ones right off the initial production run, they had some big issues. It wasn't immediate. It was when they're coming to their end of life, when they've been used for like 500 to 1,000 hours or so on. They had a plastic spindle in the disk drive, which it kind of deformed slightly, which meant that the disk wasn't sitting flat.
Okay, if that's an end of life thing, then maybe that's a bad example. But there's certainly, I mean, for example, prime example is the
red ring.
The red ring of death on the Xbox 360. Let's go with that one because everyone
kind of knows about that.
Everyone knows that one. And obviously there will have been hardware changes and things and software changes that fix that. So obviously not everyone is purely equal to a certain extent because they have to change some things occasionally. But my point is that they will change it with something that's roughly compatible, roughly equivalent, and they're not going to make any massive changes because they can't. Because if they make a massive improvement on the console without changing the console generation, then suddenly they eliminate a lot of their audience. I mean, we had this conversation before, but that's beside the point. We can't talk about it.
I think it's a very good point. They have the ability in a couple of years' time when they release the Slimline or whatever, or it's probably even 6 months down the line now because we've already had the consoles for over a year now. So when they release the Slimline version, they can, in effect, up the power of it. Like the hardware will come down in price and they can replace it with something new. But that means that either the developers can't take advantage of that properly because they've still got to target the standard console, or it means that the people who own the original console can't play some games.
Yeah, it's a slippery slide to get into. In some ways, there's a lot of advantages to doing it, and a lot of it would certainly eliminate a lot of this redundancy of the hardware that gets towards end of generation of a console. However, it becomes fragmented. Yes, it's still easier to match with than a PC because rather than catering for, as we say, all potential possible configurations, they're just catering for 2 potential configurations. They still have a minimum and a maximum, and some games that they want to push to the absolute maximum might have to be limited to just the upgrade.
Yeah, but you're kind of creating a caste system on your console, and people who either missed out on the fast generation or people who spent a huge amount more money and got the second generation as well, they will be able to play games at a higher graphical fidelity, and they will have, especially if you don't change, if you say the Xbox One releases the Slimline and it has more powerful hardware but it's still an Xbox One, then you're going to have multiplayer between the 2 machines, and again we've got this problem that we have with PC.
Yeah, it goes up to that.
All of a sudden you may have some users who have a bigger advantage. And there are extreme groups in both PC and console, and amongst the different console generations who get a bit defensive of their choice.
Some?
Well,
there's a lot of people.
No, there's a small minority who are very, very vocal. The people who use PC Master Race unironically, that actually originally started as a joke by Yahtzee, who's a game reviewer type. Well, I'm not sure if I'd classify it as game reviews, but he does game journalism, for anyone who doesn't know. And so he coined the term completely ironically, because he was very aware that there are advantages to both, and he was kind of using it to single out people who were saying that PC was unequivocally better. So there are some people who use that term unironically, and again, there are some people on console who are always very vocal whenever there's a game on console that doesn't come to PC.
Yeah, primarily you have 2 camps in the console market. You have the PlayStation camp and the Xbox camp.
Yeah.
And then you have the people who just like games in general and don't care too much or have both. But
most people just like games, and they are happy to play games, and they will base their console choice not on some pre-formed opinion of which company's better, but they will form it on basically what console is likely to have the games that they want to play.
Yeah, but I mean, this conversation has been had millions of times from millions of people, so we won't go into it in too much depth. But essentially, it boils down to most people, especially when they're younger, or particularly, well, most people in general, aren't going to go out and buy both of them at once. No. You might eventually go out and buy them both, but to begin with, you are going to have to choose one or the other.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of money to spend. And psychologically, whenever you buy anything, you have to justify that purchase in your head. And by buying one of them, choosing one of them over the other, they have to then justify in their own mind that that one is better. And they didn't make the mistake, because it's a lot of money to spend.
I've seen the exact same thing with people who went out and spent a lot of money on Apple products.
Yeah. It's not just consoles that it exists with. It exists with anything.
Any high-ticket purchase.
Not just Apple products. Yes, Apple products to a certain extent, where people will say Apple's better than. But you also get it with even within the Android ecosystem. You'll get the different manufacturers. You'll get the Samsungs. The S series are quite high market smartphones, very expensive. There will be people who insist that Samsung is better than the Nexus, is better than whatever else, better than the LGs, because it's the one they've got and they've spent so much money on it.
I actually, not quite a purchase decision, but I noticed this when I was playing a game. I was playing Dota 2 and I was playing a hero called Faceless Void, who is a hero I don't quite like playing because he's way overpowered and it's far too easy to play him, but I had to play him for my Dota 2 A to Z challenge. So I was playing him, and he has an ability which has a 120-second cooldown. Now, I intended someone else was kind of in trouble, and I was going to use this ability to save them, but they died slightly before I triggered it, and suddenly I've just used a 120-second cooldown, and I had no effect. So what I should have done was walk away from the fight and just wait 120 seconds until I was useful again. But because I knew that this had a massive cooldown, I just kind of stayed in the fight when I knew I was outnumbered. I wouldn't get the kills, and I ended up dying. So I kind of turned one death into 2 deaths, simply because I had this cost-reward type thing going on in my head, where
the justification. Oh, yeah. I've used it already. I've started the fight now. I might as well carry on.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
To speak.
And I kind of, as soon as I died, I knew exactly what I'd done wrong, but it's something which didn't occur to me until I'd lost out by dying. So these kind of biases invade our lives to such a degree, and we've got to be so vigilant to make sure that we're actually making an argument based on logic and reason rather than on emotion. And
I mean, as I say, I'm a true believer that they all have their advantages, but if you like games, you should like games. And if you can't afford to buy them all, then that's unfortunate. And you just sort of maybe save up over time, maybe purchase the other ones.
I will say, if you like playing good games and you don't have a lot of money, I would recommend a low-spec laptop, not for the AAA games, but for the indie games, because these have been overlooked for many years now. They're starting to come to the front. And there's some really high-quality stuff coming out. There's Thomas Was Alone is one of my favourite indie games, and there is also Limbo is another amazing game, which, if anyone's saying, well, our games are, you just show them Limbo, and it's like, yes, of course they are.
Well, I mean, Minecraft started off as an indie game. I don't think you can call it indie anymore, but...
Well...
and you look at how big that's gone, it's something of a craze.
It sold to Microsoft for about $2 billion, I think.
Yeah.
So, no, it's not quite indie anymore.
It's not anymore, but my point is that's what it started out as. It started out as an early alpha and then beta release that he chucked out on
forums, mainly.
On forums,
he was selling it for his own site, and in fact that's still how it sold, because he didn't like some of the restrictions that Steam placed on it. Of course, Notch no longer actually works for Mojang and hasn't worked on Minecraft for a long time, but it did actually start out as one man in a spare room writing code that he wanted to see, he just wanted to play this game, so he made this game. And other people wanted to play this game, so he's put it up for sale and they started buying it. But I think Minecraft is more of an example of the early access system done really, really well, as opposed to an example of the indie situation, because by the time it started getting traction, and by the time it was released, certainly, Mojang were raking in millions of dollars a day on sales. So I think before they actually came to full release, Notch stopped actually describing it, Mojang, as an indie studio. He didn't quite know what to describe it as because it's not AAA, but it was more of a self-published game than an indie game at that point. So, yeah, I do highly recommend getting just an ordinary laptop. You've probably got one lying around, and using that to play some indie games, see if there's any good ones. I wouldn't go with anything early access because there's very few really good early access games, and you always take a risk with them. But if you go for fully released indie games and you look at the ones that have really high reviews and are kind of really well known, you can get some...
There's plenty of lists out there. Just Google,
or even look in Steam for the top-selling indie games.
Yeah, or Steam curators. Plenty of Steam curators out there. I mean, obviously not everyone's going to be, but if you have a few games that you like and they're all on a list of a curator that's made some lists, maybe see what else that person's liked. It's a good way of doing things. I've discovered new games that way.
Quite apart from the indie scene, you get companies like GOG, which they've branched out a bit, but they originally started out selling good old games, basically really good games. They would get the license to resell them, and they would patch all of the bugs in the game so that they would run on modern hardware. And these games are actually really good if you don't have much money to spend, because some of them are like 20, 30 years old by now, and they're still really great games, and they're still really compelling games, but because they was made so long ago, it doesn't take much to run them.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, that is another main point, is that there's all this fight and struggle over making things look visually amazing, and realistically, I've played some games with terrible graphics in comparison to, I mean, as you say, and especially indie games, they don't have these graphical sort of eye candy, as they call it, that a lot of people associate with the AAA games, and some of them can be as good, if not better, than a lot of the AAA games in terms of what the game you play.
If you look at AAA games released last year, certainly, I mean, Assassin's Creed Unity still doesn't work properly, Battlefield 4 still doesn't work properly, they're still going ahead and releasing Battlefield Hardline, but apparently 4 has gotten a lot better, but 4 by no means is a good game to play multiplayer on, and
I wouldn't know, I don't tend to keep track of these things, but you obviously hear about them when they initially release and have problems and things.
Far Cry 4 had a load of problems on launch. I think Far Cry 4 had problems with SLI that still haven't been fixed. It may have been another game, but...
See, that's a big one. I mean, you're talking... By the time you're talking SLI, you're talking the top sort of people who have a lot of money, who've invested a lot of money in their gaming rig and bought at least 2 graphics cards, if not more.
Maybe, maybe not. It's generally considered that if you've got space in your case, then getting 2 slightly cheaper graphics card of lower power and running them in SLI or Crossfire is actually a better option than getting 1 more powerful card that would cost you roughly the same. So it's an interesting choice there. Of course, once you're talking about running 3 Titans in a case, then you are talking about the upper level gamers. And
but regardless, my point is by the time you're looking at SLI issues, you're certainly looking at people who've purchased more than 1 graphics card.
Yeah.
So you're not talking sort of unless you're talking sort of the expensive gaming rigs that you can buy. You're not talking an off the shelf setup here. You're talking certainly a big chunk of money invested into that. So by the time you're looking at problems with that, you're looking at annoying your user base that's investing money into the market.
They will pay the same amount as other people, but they will probably pre-order more often, and they will probably be more likely to buy your next game,
they might well buy games earlier on. I mean, as you mentioned Steam earlier, Steam is a great way of, if you want a game and you're not particularly bothered about when you get it, you chuck it in the Steam wishlist and wait till it's on special offer.
Yeah.
Whereas these people who are willing to spend lots of money and get the latest hardware, the latest games, they will often, as you say, pre-purchase for the higher prices, or purchase certainly near a release when it's a much higher price. I mean, on release, consoles and PC games are usually very similar in price.
Yeah. It's usually slightly cheaper on PC, but what I really want to see, and I don't...
In my experience, when we're talking slightly cheaper, it's usually only about £2 or £3, sometimes as much as £5.
Yeah,
it's
but
rarely more than that.
If you're talking £5 and you are going to buy lots of games in a year, if you are one of the higher end people,
yeah, true.
Then £5 times, say, 20 games, or even 12 games, for example, that's £60. That's another game you can buy.
Yeah.
If you save £5 on each game, but that's beside the point. Yeah, I really dislike the pre-order culture and the early access culture. With pre-orders, there's absolutely no reason to ever buy a pre-order game.
Especially seeing as these days, I don't know whether it's a requirement, but most games will release pre-order bonuses, and then, but it's limited time exclusivity, and you'll have this bonus, and you'll have maybe something extra, and then maybe 6 months, 12 months down the line, they'll release it as purchasable DLC, or you'll get either that, or you'll have a physical item that comes with the game. But again, it's usually just a piece of plastic or an art card or something, which is nice as a sort of...
Yeah, I think this comes mainly from the big distributors. You're talking Game and Amazon and GameStop and people like that. They will make it a requirement. If they're going to publicise the game very heavily, they'll make it a requirement that there's something extra which gives them an advantage. So you quite often get 3, 4, 5 different sets of pre-order bonuses depending on where you buy from. And they want people to be spending money as early as possible. But the problem with this is, you then have to make a purchasing decision before the review copies have been sent out and before the review embargo has been given up. And that's a really bad place to be in. I'm slightly happier with early access because you can look at the game and say, is this game, at the current quality, is this game something I would like to pay this money for and have this game?
Yeah, or the Destiny pre-order bonus was a beta access code, which was great because you could pre-order the game, get your beta access code, play the beta, and then if you didn't like it, you still had time to cancel your pre-order.
And hey, to be fair, most people experience the majority of Destiny in the beta.
Yeah.
Like, there isn't a whole lot of content beyond that.
Well, I mean, they've got DLC packs, but, I mean, I don't know much about them because they're basically the price of a new game on their own. And
yeah.
I didn't get enough of a game from the first game to want to buy a whole new game for the same price.
I've heard a lot of criticism about Destiny. I kind of missed out on it because it's an MMO. I don't care if they call it a piece of
POS, but there's a POS, what's it, persistent online shooter or something like that. I saw it described as.
Yeah, that's what Bungie are calling it, a persistent online shooter. I'm sorry, it's an MMO, and if I want to play an MMO, I've got an old RuneScape account that I'll dust off and play it for a while until I realise that this whole thing is entirely pointless and grindy, and I will go back to playing.
I mean, I really enjoyed the gameplay. I really enjoyed the gameplay of Destiny, but it's, as you said, there's not enough of the game there. It gets very repetitive very quickly, and
well, I had someone who actually is interested in MMOs and who has played World of Warcraft and so on for a very long time. The way they described it is, Bungie took the worst parts of MMOs and the worst parts of shooters and mashed them together and produced Destiny. And if it's a game that has grind, then yes, they did take the worst part of MMOs. And I'm not too familiar with the first-person shooter, despite having an entire series that kind of attached to that. But I'm not really familiar about the differences in first-person shooters to actually say whether they did shooting bad, but I will say if it's an MMO and it's grindy, I'm really not interested. You may as well make a walking simulator and let me experience the dazzling environment.
Yeah, I must say I'm very much the same with MMOs. I don't play a lot of them purely because you don't get as much entertainment. You don't have the ongoingness. I mean, to be honest, I'm the same with even first-person shooters and things to a certain extent. I'll play them short-term and I really enjoy them, but when it comes to a longer-term gaming, I get very much... I just find it very repetitive, and they release map packs and things, but I can't get into the Call of Duty series, for example, because every single game to me adds maybe a few new features, but the multiplayer particularly is...
The iterations aren't big enough to make something new.
Yeah, and...
The only reason you would buy a new Call of Duty game, aside from Advanced Warfare, that actually looks like it does bring some really new things to the table. Unfortunately, it released after Titanfall did, which, in my opinion, the things I wanted out of... Well, the things I found interesting out of Advanced Warfare were done better by Titanfall. And that's not to say that Titanfall is a better game, because sadly the audience size on PC tends to suggest that maybe it's not. But I'm not really interested in it as a competitive shooter. I'm interested in it as I get to jump around with a jetpack and do all this parkour movie stuff, and then I get mechs. They gave me mechs.
Mechs are always fun.
That's all you need to do to sell me games. Put a mech in it and make it half decent. And so that's what Titanfall did, and that's not what Advanced Warfare did. So just for me personally, pure opinion, but I prefer Titanfall. But yeah, I think Advanced Warfare tried to make a stride forward and make a big difference, but generally speaking, the only reason you should buy a new Call of Duty game is if you want to follow the audience and to have your multiplayer game filled up quickly.
Or if you enjoy the single player. Of course.
Sorry.
There will be people who enjoy playing single player.
It's gone downhill a very long way since they started doing the first Modern Warfare game.
As I say, I can't speak because I haven't played them, but there will be people who enjoy just running through and shooting up a bunch of enemies. Do you know what I mean? There are plenty. I know there's plenty of games out there like that, but sometimes if you don't want to focus on a heavy storyline-based game or anything, sometimes just and you don't want to play necessarily competitive, sometimes just sitting back and running through is.
I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's better blast 'em up games.
Oh yeah, no, but I'm sure there are. But...
This is going back to like 2D side-scroller blast 'em up games. I can think
Doom.
Doom, yes, Unreal Tournament. Well, Doom was good. Unreal Tournament was more of an arena shooter.
Yeah,
it did have a very compelling story mode, and I get the impression that there isn't really the focus on the story mode in the Call of Duty or Battlefield franchises, and they don't quite get it as polished as they get the multiplayer, and it's generally speaking a very short campaign from what I've heard. So
yeah,
if you want to pay £60 for an unpolished, really short campaign, then go ahead and buy those games. But I'm sure you can find even indie games or something like that do the same thing except slightly better.
See, this is the problem with consoles: is they tend to get stuck in these sort of ruts to a certain extent because the hardware is consistent. The games tend to be fairly consistent. I mean, obviously there are some gems that shine out amongst the rest, but
it's not the consoles; it's the AAA developers, and you notice it more on consoles because that's the majority of the games on there. There are starting to, like both companies, Microsoft and Sony, are starting to bring in indie developers and they're starting to release indie hits, but a large number of those indie hits are ones that are already on PC and they're just porting over.
Yeah, so, usually ones that have already made it fairly big on the PC and have...
Yeah, pretty much. There are, I follow someone on Twitter, a local developer who's part of a company releasing a brand new game and they're releasing it on Xbox. So that is one of the exceptions, but yeah, the majority of games on Xbox and PlayStation are AAA games, and AAA games tend to play it safe, which I can absolutely understand why they do this, because they are spending, using one of the most popular ones, Grand Theft Auto 5 cost $500 million to make. If you don't have 10 times that in revenue, you're not going to get another game from a major publisher.
Yeah.
And so they've got to play it safe. They've got to do what they know works. Of course, Grand Theft Auto 5, not quite a good example of that, because it introduced a load of new things, and Grand Theft Auto tend to be one of the better franchises, AAA franchises.
But again, a game not without its issues on initial release. As I hear it, on what is now previous generation, Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, the transition between characters, I'm thinking of the right game, aren't I? We have the different characters you can switch between.
Yeah, that is GTA 5.
This transition, as I hear it, the transition between characters is slow and very loady and...
Well, yeah, but they released it on previous generation hardware after the next generation hardware had been released, so you've got to expect that some of the stuff was kind of not quite working as smoothly as they would have liked. I mean, we talked about The Last of Us burning out consoles. This is kind of one step beyond The Last of Us, except it's not burning out consoles. So they did trim back some of the things, like some of the loading times maybe are a bit less smooth and a bit longer than you would like, but it's the trade-off you pay for playing the previous generation.
But maybe a good example of a game that did try and cut back, perhaps, then.
Yeah, and also, you've got to applaud them for releasing on previous generation.
Oh yes, so many games are not being released on previous generation anymore. But then again, you can understand from their point of view, because they want to try and sell the new generation.
Well, I'll say this. They will have made a lot of extra sales because they staggered the releases. I think it was 6 months between... It was 6 or 12 months. In fact, it was only November, so yeah, it was 12 months between releasing on previous generation and releasing on next generation. In that time, you've got a lot of people who are willing to pay an extra $60 for the new features you put in there.
Particularly seeing as there would be much more uptake of the new generation consoles by that point.
Yeah, and same kind of thing. It's gone 6 months now, I believe, or just about to go 6 months, between the console release, the next generation console release, and the PC release. They're going to get a lot more sales there, mainly from people who just want to play it on mods.
Yeah.
Or play it on the slightly higher graphical settings that are available to PC. So, yeah, Grand Theft Auto, probably not a good good example of a company which does the same thing over and over again, but it's an example of how much these games cost to make. And if you're releasing a game every year costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, you're going to have to make that back every year. And so you want to release a Call of Duty game that your existing audience are going to like. You don't want to try anything new and get it wrong.
Well, I mean, another hardware example of this, of course, the console releases have massive gaps between them, and the hardware has changed so much. You look at something much more regular release, like smartphones, say the, consistent, the Samsung Galaxy S series or the iPhone series, who are releasing on a almost annual release release schedule.
I think iOS will, there will be a new phone every 2 years.
Yeah, I think they're on a biannual release, aren't they?
And there will be a software update in the intervening year.
But
anyway, I think we're slightly running out of time, so back to our original topic. If you are worried about lower spec hardware causing you issues on PC, I think our conclusion was, don't pre-order games. That's the most useful piece of advice we've actually come up with.
Or wait and get a console, because I think that's it. Is realistically, anyone who's willing to invest the money, I think basically PCs match the low end, I don't have much money, I'm going to use a sort of computer I have anyway, or the high end, sort of, I want to invest lots of money into it. And the consoles kind of fill that middle, that sort of, I just
Yeah.
want a device that sits there and does.
Yeah, I think that's kind of it. If you are worried about the low spec hardware, then either save up to get a better PC or save up to get a console. And on that note, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, don't feed the
Bye.
trolls.